We now come to the motion on the draft Social Security Contributions Regulations, which will be debated together with the motion on the draft Child Benefit and Guardian's Allowance Uprating Order. I call the Minister to move the first motion. Minister James Murray.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I beg to move that this House considers both the Social Security Contributions Limits and Thresholds, National Insurance Funds Payments and Extension of Veterans Relief Regulations 2025 and the Child Benefit and Guardian's Allowance Uprating Order 2025. Madam Deputy Speaker, these regulations are made each year to set various national insurance thresholds and to uprate child benefit and guardian's allowance. To open this debate, I will set out details to the House of what they set out to do. First, the Social Security Contributions, Limits and Thresholds, National Insurance Funds Payments and Extension of Veterans Relief Regulations 2025 sets the rates of certain national insurance contribution classes and the level of certain thresholds for the 25-26 tax year. The lower earnings limit, the small profits threshold, the rate of Class 2 and the rate of Class 3 contributions will all be uprated by September CPI of 1.7%, whilst the other limits and thresholds that these regulations cover will remain fixed at their existing levels. The regulations also make provision for a Treasury grant to be paid into the National Insurance Fund if required for the same tax year through a transfer of wider government funds into the National Insurance Fund. These regulations also, importantly, extend the Veterans Employer National Insurance Contributions Relief until April 2026. The scope of the regulations under discussion today is limited to the 25-26 tax year. Now, as honourable members will know, national insurance contributions are social security contributions. They allow people to make contributions when they're in work to receive contributory benefits when they're not working, for example, after they have retired or if they become unemployed. National insurance contribution receipts fund these contributory benefits, as well as helping to fund the NHS. Now, the primary threshold and the lower profits limit are the points at which employees and the self-employed start to pay employee Class 1 and self-employed Class 4 national insurance contributions, respectively. The primary threshold and lower profits limit have been frozen by the previous government at £12,570 until April 2028. However, the level of these thresholds do not affect people's ability to build up entitlement toward contributory benefits such as the state pension. For employees, this entitlement is determined by their earnings being above the lower earnings limit, which these regulations will uprate from £123 a week in 24-25 to £125 per week in 25-26. That's the equivalent of an uprating from £6,396 to £6,500 per year. For self-employed people, their entitlement is determined by their earnings being above the small profits threshold, which these regulations will upgrade from £6,725 in 24-25 to £6,845 for 25-26. Madam Deputy Speaker, uprating the lower earnings limit and the small profits threshold is the usual process and maintains the real level of income where someone gains entitlement to contributory benefits. Wage growth is currently higher than inflation, which means that following the uprating by CPI, there will be a reduction in the number of hours someone who has received the typical wage increase needs to work to gain entitlement compared to last year. Now, the upper earnings limit, the point at which the main rate of employee national insurance contributions drops to 2%, and the upper profits limit, the point at which the main rate of self-employed national insurance contributions drops to 2%, are aligned with the higher rate threshold for the income tax at £50,270 a year. The previous government also froze those thresholds until April 2028. I will now turn to the thresholds for employer national insurance contributions reliefs. As honourable members are aware, the government has had to make difficult decisions to fix the public finances. One of the toughest decisions we faced was to increase the rate of employer national insurance contributions and reduce the secondary threshold. Although those changes are the subject of a separate bill and not the regulations before us, they are the context in which our decision to maintain other targeted national insurance contributions reliefs are so important. Those employer reliefs include those for under 21s, under 25 apprentices, veterans, and new employees in free ports and investment zones. The regulations we are debating set these thresholds in line with other personal tax thresholds. The regulations also make provision for the national insurance contributions relief for employees of veterans to be extended for a year until April 2026. This measure means that next year, businesses will be able to continue to pay no employer national insurance contributions on salaries up to the veterans' upper secondary threshold of £50,270 for the first year of a qualifying veterans' employment in civilian role.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank my honourable friend for giving way. I welcome absolutely the extension of the national insurance contributions relief for veterans, but does he agree with me that we need to do more to ensure that employers across the country know that that relief exists to incentivise employing veterans?
Minister.
Well, I thank my honourable friend very much for his intervention, and he's absolutely right that we want to make sure employers are aware of this important relief to encourage them to make use of it, to employ veterans. We know that this relief helps to support those who have already given so much to our country, and it also means that we can use the skills and the huge potential of those people who have already served our country so much to make a further contribution towards our country and our economy. And we want to make sure all employers know that this relief exists, and I think it is a role that we can all play as local MPs to make sure that all employers in our constituencies are aware of this important relief. So again, I thank my honourable friend for using this opportunity for me to make that point. Madam Deputy Speaker, the continuation of the veterans' relief that I've been talking about is evidence of the government's commitment to support our veterans. As I've explaining in response to my honourable friend's intervention, it's intended to incentivise employers to take advantage of the wide range of skills and experience that ex-military personnel offer. And as I said to my honourable friend, I think it's important that we support those who've given so much to our country by helping to make sure that our country benefits further from the skills and potential of our service leavers. Madam Deputy Speaker, to move on now to the National Insurance Fund, which is where the majority of national insurance contributions are paid and which is used to pay the state pension and other contributory benefits. The Treasury has the ability to transfer funds from wider government revenues into the National Insurance Fund. The regulations before us make provision for a transfer of this kind, known as a Treasury grant, of up to 5% of forecasted annual benefit expenditure to be paid into the National Insurance Fund if needed in 2025-26. A similar provision will be made in respect to the Northern Ireland National Insurance Fund. Now, the Government Actuary Department report laid alongside these regulations forecast that a Treasury grant will not be required in 2025-26, but as a precautionary measure, the Government considers it prudent to make provision at this stage for a Treasury grant which is consistent with what has been done in previous years. I will now turn to the Child Benefit and Guardians Allowance Upgrading Order 2025. Madam Deputy Speaker, as honourable members will know, the Government is committed to delivering a welfare system that is fair for taxpayers whilst providing support to those who need it. The regulations before us will ensure that benefits for which Treasury ministers are responsible and which HMRC delivers are uprated by inflation in April 2025. Child Benefit and Guardians Allowance will increase in line with the Consumer Price Index, which had inflation at 1.7% in the year to September 2024. Uprating by the preceding September CPI is the Government's typical approach. Tax credit awards will end on the 5th of April 2025 and therefore no changes to rates will be required from 25-26 onward. I hope all members will support these regulations, as rejecting them would mean that HMRC administered benefits do not rise at all next year and therefore would lose value in real terms. In summary, Madam Deputy Speaker, these regulations fix most of the rates and thresholds for national insurance contributions which they cover at the 24-25 levels for the 25-26 tax year, except for the lower earnings limit, the small profits threshold, the rates of Class 2 and the rates of Class 3 contributions, which will all be uprated by September 2024 CPI of 1.7%. These regulations also make provision for a Treasury grant. They extend the Veterans Employers National Insurance Contributions relief and increase the rates of child benefit and guardians allowance in line with prices. I'll give way.
The Minister, as a matter of curiosity, talked about the Treasury grant being up to 5%. What was the figure that the Treasury planned to put in?
Minister.
Well, the provision within these regulations is a provision should it be needed, and the expectation is it's not. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a Government Actuary Department report which is laid alongside the regulations, which forecasts the Treasury grant will not be required in 25-26. So this provision in the regulations is a precautionary measure, which is in line with what's happened in previous years. But the Government considers it prudent to continue that process of previous years and make provision for it within these regulations. I hope that answers the honourable gentleman's question. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, in relation in relation to the child benefit and the guardian's allowance, the increase with prices is enabled by these regulations, and without these regulations, HMRC would be unable to collect national insurance contributions receipts, and child benefit and guardian's allowance would be frozen at their 24 to 25 levels. And I hope colleagues will join me in supporting these regulations.
Before I call... apologies. The question is the motion on the draft social security regulations as on the order paper. Before I call the Shadow Minister, I would just like to make sure that the Lib Dem spokesman appreciates that I will be calling him immediately after the Shadow Minister. Gareth Davies.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the opportunity to contribute on behalf of His Majesty's opposition. Now, on the first statutory instrument, as the Minister said, these regulations set rates, limits and thresholds for national insurance contributions for the 2025-2026 tax year. They cover the rate of Class 2 NICs in the small profits threshold, the rate of voluntary Class 3 NICs, the zero rate relief on secondary Class 1 NICs for qualifying armed forces veterans, a legacy which we on this side of the House are very proud of from the Conservative government, the various upper secondary thresholds, and of course the upper limits and thresholds which determine Class 1 NICs. These regulations also allow, as the Minister was saying, for payments of a Treasury grant not exceeding 5% of the estimated benefit expenditure for the 2025-2026 tax year. This is to be made into the National Insurance Fund with a corresponding provision for Northern Ireland. While we welcome the uprating with CPI of the Class 1 lower earnings limit and the Class 2 small profits threshold, the overall picture here in these regulations is very much one of continuity, not of change. The secondary threshold, of course, however, is the exception. Although these regulations leave it unchanged, this will not last for very long. Instead, they'll be overridden by the National Insurance Bill, which is currently under consideration in the other place, and which cuts the secondary threshold from a weekly level of £176 down to £96 in the coming tax year, on top of the secondary Class 1 NICs rate being raised to 15%. The disastrous job-destroying consequences of Labour's £25 billion tax on working people are well known by now and have been debated in this place many times. They're also widely acknowledged from the independent OBR to the left-wing Resolution Foundation. When in opposition this time last year, the Minister put on record his concern at the distributional impact of freezes to allowances, limits and thresholds, which his government is in large part continuing. These are difficult decisions which we took and accept to return the public finances to a sustainable footing in the aftermath, in our case, of a double crisis of the pandemic and of the energy price shock driven by the disgraceful invasion of Ukraine. However, if the Minister was concerned about the distributional impact back then, in particular, and I quote, the post-tax income for low and middle earners, I wonder just how concerned he is now in the context of his own party's budget. As the IFS have shown, the largest percentage increases in labour costs will be inflicted on lower wage workers. Meanwhile, as much as 76% of the additional tax burden will be passed on to those same workers in the form of lower real wages, according to the independent OBR. So let me ask, does the Minister agree with the OBR and the IFS on the distributional impact of the NICs tax hike?
Will you give way on that point?
Yeah.
Great for the Shadow Minister giving way. He's talked about context, which is really important, and this is a finance SI, but of course the wider context is another bill is being brought forward, which is the Employment Rights Bill, which is estimated to cost £5 billion on top of current existing tax measures within that budget. How does he feel that will impact directly people who are trying to get works? Because surely there's going to be the chance that more people are going to be made unemployed or let loose because of this potential cost and impact.
Gareth Davies.
Well, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend. I completely agree with the point that he is making. In fact, it's been made to me by several of my local businesses in Grantham and Bourne, that this is a double whammy. On the one hand, you have a tax increase, which increases the cost of doing business, the profitability of those businesses, and in some cases the survival of those businesses. But in addition to that, they're being hit with additional regulation, which businesses themselves, including the CBI, have made clear will add to the burden of regulation and make it less easy to actually hire people, or in some cases even keep them. And so this double whammy, I'm afraid, will result in job freezes at best, or in some tragic cases, job losses. And I think we should all be very concerned about that. But to be fair to the Minister, he has expressed in the past great concern about the lower paid in our society and among people who work in all of our constituencies. And so let me ask him, going back to the point that I was making, has he undertaken his own distribution analysis of changes to national insurance rates, limits and thresholds in the round? If he has, does this analysis show anything different to what the OBR and the IFS have shown? Now, I'd also like to highlight that the impact note for this specific statutory instrument actually predates the October budget. So I hope, and surely there is, an updated impact analysis to consider the new context. And I'd be grateful if he could confirm that and if he could show us it. Finally, I'd also be grateful if the Minister could confirm whether the Treasury is considering an extension of the veterans' zero rate relief beyond 2026, or will this now act as a final sunset date for the relief? He was absolutely right to say that we all have a part to play in highlighting this to businesses. We want to see veterans hired in our country, and in my case, again in my constituency, we have one of the largest populations of veterans, and I certainly will join him in doing anything we can on this side of the House to better inform businesses of this benefit. But it would be good, I think, if he could confirm whether there are any plans or intentions to extend it beyond the 2026 point at which this measure puts in. Now, turning to the statutory instrument on child benefit and guardians allowance, as the Minister has also said, this statutory instrument uprates child benefit and guardians allowance in line with CPI for the 2025 to 2026 tax year. These benefits are an important part of our welfare system, and we welcome the vital support that they provide. However, as the Joseph Rowntree Foundation itself has pointed out in the past, and we agree with this, work is the most important route out of poverty. Between 2010 and 2024, Conservative governments helped create 4 million jobs, and the proportion of children living in workless households fell from 16% to 10%. Even as employment increased, the proportion of all jobs considered low paid declined from 20% in 2010 to just 3.4% in 2024, something which I hope this whole House will welcome and recognise. Yet Labour have never left office with unemployment lower than they found it. And within 4 months of their first budget, unemployment is on the rise, with the number of workers on payrolls dropping by the most we've seen since the peak of the pandemic. Meanwhile, the OBR says Labour's jobs tax will weigh on real wages, with inflation also expected to rise in the near term, and many of the Minister's backbench Labour colleagues no doubt taking the view that child benefit provision is not generous enough. Can I ask, has the government prepared an assessment of the impact of its budget measures on levels of child poverty over the next 12 months, and in particular the impact its jobs tax may have through higher unemployment and lower pay? And is the Minister, finally, confident that this uprating will cancel out any adverse consequences of the points that I've been making around the budget? Thank you.
Steve Darling.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I and the Liberal Democrats would welcome the fact that the Minister has suggested that the proposals today are yoked to what is the national insurance increases that we are seeing going through the other place. Since the general election, we've had doom and gloom until very, very recently from the Labour Party, and the uncertainty around the budget and what came out as far as the national insurance increases that are yet to hit has only put the cold hand around economic growth that we need to see pumping harder in our economy. In my own part of the world, in the West Country, it is having a massive impact on our tourist industry. The fact that the thresholds where you start to pay national insurances are going down from 9,200 to 5,000 mean that businesses in my own constituency of Torbay, such as Paynton Pier, Paynton Zoo and Splashdown, all have massive increases in those seasonal worker costs, both in the threshold hitting harder as well as the increases in national insurance costs. And when I speak to businesses such as Splashdown in Paynton, they tell me that actually it means that they're going to probably operate for longer, for less, and maybe look and seeing how they can reduce the number of staff that they're taking on. So sadly, the national insurance increase is a jobs tax on our tourist industry as well as the rest of our economy. Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm only too well aware that the cost to hospitality is £1 billion, and that is extremely disturbing, where again people will not be taken on due to these cost pressures, and therefore it really is a jobs tax. Very happily, thank you.
I do thank my honourable friend for giving way. I'm very interested in what my honourable friend is saying about the threat to jobs. Can I point out that from the other end of the country, the north of Scotland, that it's the same issue, and the loss of any jobs in the hospitality industry is very disastrous, where we don't have much employment anyway, or we'd like much more, put it that way.
Steve Darling.
Thank you. I am delighted with the intervention because as Liberal Democrats, we do represent from Shetland to the Isles of Scilly the full length of this United Kingdom. And so it is important that we hear from the breadth of colleagues the impact. And we do represent some of the best places to go on holiday as Liberal Democrats across the UK. But we do have a significant high-tech industry in Torbay, and again, that manufacturing industry tells me that their owners abroad may be asking for them to offshore some of their manufacturing to places such as Taiwan, where there is where taxes on employment are significantly lower. So again, this is another significant impact of these national insurance contributions. I would also like to reflect on Bay Care, which is an outstanding social care business where Kat Hall, one of the senior managers there, tells me how this is significantly impact. Bay Care operate under really tight margins, and yet they will have to reduce services or equally limit the offers that they've got to our communities, both across South Devon and Torbay, with the reductions that we've seen in our services that will inevitably impact on the offer for social care. Finally, the voluntary sector, particularly Torbay Communities, is an outstanding service that serves the people of South Devon and Torbay, and yet we're looking at significant challenges for them with the national insurances, and the fact that they will have to reflect and see where they reduce staff and actually stop supporting some of those most vulnerable in Torbay and South Devon that are in need. So I would, with due respect to the Minister, ask them to reflect on these increases and see how they can alleviate them, particularly in areas of hospitality, social care and the voluntary sector. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
If there are no further speakers, James Murray.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and with leave of the House, I'll respond to the comments made by other members. Firstly, Madam Deputy Speaker, we heard from the Shadow Minister who set out the official opposition's response to these regulations and order before us today, although his comments are largely related to a different bill, the changes a different bill is making, so I will be careful not to try your patience as Deputy Speaker, Madam Deputy Speaker, by veering onto another bill today, wanting, of course, to stay strictly within the confines of the regulations and order that we are debating. Of course, briefly, it is worth me saying that, as the honourable gentleman well knows, we had to take difficult decisions at the budget last October, and one of the toughest decisions was the decision to increase the rate of employer national insurance contributions and to cut the secondary threshold. The reason why we had to take those difficult decisions is because of the fiscal situation we inherited from the previous government, of which the honourable gentleman was a member. And I note that in his recollection of history, he referred to a double crisis. I think, Madam Deputy Speaker, it was at the very least a triple crisis, given Liz Truss's premiership in this country and leadership of his party. So he may be omitting certain factors of the historical record there, although I'm sure the wider British public will make no such mistake. Madam Deputy Speaker, the honourable gentleman spoke about some of the impacts of national insurance changes. Again, he was speaking about a different bill rather than the regulations before us today, and for that separate bill there is, of course, a tax information and impact note published as standardly is the case. I very much welcome the honourable gentleman's support for our extension of veterans relief to help get more ex-service personnel into employment. The government has extended the relief for 1 year until April 2026, and of course the scope of the regulations under discussion today is limited to the 25-26 tax year. Therefore, these regulations themselves could only extend it by that 1 year, but we think it is very important to do so. The honourable gentleman spoke about work being the best way out of poverty, and I agree entirely with him on that. Of course, it's important when we are creating jobs, making sure that businesses can invest and provide work opportunities for people across the country, that they are decent jobs with decent pay, and so our changes to the national living wage are of course important in that respect. But overall, if one were to look at all of the measures in the budget, the OBR concludes that the employment level will rise from 33.1 million to 34.3 million between 2024 and 2029. The spokesperson from the Liberal Democrats also spoke about a different bill other than the regulations we're debating today. But I would like to reassure him, Madam Deputy Speaker, and point him toward the comments the Chancellor has made since taking office last July, where from the very first few days in number 11 Downing Street, she's been determined to boost growth by getting rid of the ban on onshore wind turbines, by reforming the way that pensions can invest, by making sure the planning barriers, regulatory barriers, get out of the way of the growth that we are determined to achieve for this country. And her growth speech last week was just the latest example of her leadership in taking those decisions, which are the right ones for our country to boost investment and growth. And of course, we know that having a stable set of public finances is a prerequisite for that investment and for that growth. And so the difficult decisions, which both opposition spokespeople are referred to in their contributions, which are slightly off the topic of the regulations in front of us today, nonetheless draw attention to the fact that those difficult decisions were precisely to restore the public finances while supporting public services, therefore allowing investment to increase and seeking the growth which we are determined to deliver for this country.
The question is the motion on the draft Social Security contributions, rates, limits and thresholds amendments, National Insurance Funds payments and extension of veterans relief regulations as on the order paper. As many as are of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. We now come to the motion on the draft child benefit and guardians allowance uprating order. Minister to move formally. The question is the motion on the draft child benefit and guardians allowance uprating order as on the order paper. As many as are of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes